When people think of Samsung today, they think of smartphones, semiconductors, OLED screens, and a logo that feels almost synonymous with modern technology itself. What is often forgotten is that Samsung did not begin as a technology company at all. It began as a trading business in 1938, exporting dried fish noodles and groceries in a Korea that was poor, colonized, and uncertain about its future. The evolution of Samsung from a small trading company into one of the most powerful technology conglomerates in the world is not a story of a single breakthrough or a visionary product. It is a story of adaptability at national scale, of disciplined imitation turning into innovation, and of a corporate philosophy built around survival speed and relentless reinvention. Samsung's origins are inseparable from the history of South Korea itself. Founded by Lee Byung-chul, Samsung was created in an era where entrepreneurship was less about disruption and more about endurance. Korea lacked capital infrastructure and global access. To survive, a company had to be flexible enough to move wherever opportunity appeared. Samsung's early years were defined by this pragmatism. It traded what could be traded, entered industries that were necessary rather than glamorous, and learned how to operate across supply chains long before it had any interest in advanced technology. From the beginning, Samsung was not ideological about what it made. It was strategic about where value might emerge next. This mindset shaped Samsung's expansion into manufacturing in the post-war period. As South Korea industrialized, Samsung followed the country's development priorities: textiles, sugar insurance construction, and consumer goods. These moves were not random. They reflected a belief that scale mattered more than specialization in the early stages of nation-building. Samsung became a chaebol, a diversified conglomerate designed to grow alongside the state, absorb risk across sectors, and execute government-led industrial strategy. This relationship between company and country would later become a critical advantage when Samsung entered technology, because it had already learned how to operate at massive scale under pressure. Samsung's first steps into electronics were not heroic. They were cautious and imitative. In the 1960s and 1970s, Samsung produced radios, televisions, and appliances by learning from Japanese and Western firms. Quality was inconsistent. Branding was weak. Samsung was not admired. But this phase mattered enormously. Samsung learned manufacturing discipline, supply chain control, and cost optimization. It learned how to produce at volume, how to reverse engineer competitors, and how to improve incrementally. Where Silicon Valley prized originality, Samsung prized execution. This difference would later define its competitive edge. The turning point came in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Samsung confronted a brutal truth about its position in the global market. It could not survive indefinitely as a low-cost imitator. Japanese firms dominated quality. American firms dominated design and software. If Samsung remained stuck in the middle, it would eventually be crushed. This realization culminated in what is now legendary inside the company chairman Lee Kun-hee's new management declaration in 1993. His message was blunt and symbolic. Change everything except your wife and children. It was not a motivational slogan. It was a demand for cultural transformation. Quality became the new obsession. Factories were restructured. Defective products were publicly destroyed to send a message that mediocrity was unacceptable. Engineers were empowered. Global talent was recruited. Samsung began to invest heavily in research and development, not because innovation was fashionable, but because it was necessary for survival. This shift marked Samsung's transition from follower to contender. The company was still pragmatic, but it now understood that speed alone was not enough. Differentiation had to be earned. Semiconductors became the clearest expression of this new ambition. Samsung's decision to invest aggressively in memory chips was risky, capital-intensive, and long-term. Few companies could afford the scale required. Even fewer were willing to endure the cyclical volatility of the chip industry. Samsung embraced both. By building enormous fabrication plants and continuously reinvesting profits, Samsung positioned itself as a volume leader. Over time, this scale advantage translated into cost leadership learning curves and technological competence. Memory chips are not glamorous, but they are foundational. By dominating them, Samsung embedded itself deep into the global technology stack. This foundation enabled Samsung's later rise in consumer technology. Smartphones, televisions, and displays were no longer isolated products. They were expressions of vertical integration. Samsung made its own screens, chips, batteries, and components. This allowed faster iteration and tighter control than competitors who relied on external suppliers. When the smartphone era arrived, Samsung was ready not because it had the best software ecosystem, but because it could out-execute rivals at hardware scale. Android gave Samsung a platform. Samsung gave Android industrial muscle. Samsung's ascent to global prominence was not smooth. Product failures, patent battles, and internal complexity tested the organization repeatedly. Yet Samsung's culture was uniquely suited to endure these shocks. Speed of response mattered more than public perfection. When mistakes occurred, Samsung moved quickly to correct them. This agility, combined with enormous resources, made it difficult to corner. Competitors might win individual battles, but Samsung's breadth allowed it to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. What truly distinguishes Samsung's evolution is that it never relied on a single identity. It did not define itself narrowly as a phone company, a chip company, or an appliance brand. It defined itself as a company that builds the future's infrastructure, whatever form that infrastructure might take. Displays, memory logic, chips, networks, consumer devices, and industrial systems all fit this logic. Samsung's power lies in optionality. It can shift emphasis as technology cycles change, without having to reinvent itself from scratch. And it is exactly here that the deeper question of Samsung's evolution begins to emerge. Because once a company becomes this vast, this integrated, and this central to global technology, its greatest challenge is no longer growth, but coherence, no longer execution, but direction. And we are forced to ask how a conglomerate built on speed, scale, and adaptation can maintain focus, ethical clarity, and innovative edge in a world where technology is not just an industry, but a force shaping societies, politics, and daily life itself. And that unresolved tension is the unfinished thought we must now carry forward into the next part. And when this unresolved tension is carried into Samsung's present and future, the story becomes less about catching up or outproducing rivals, and more about governance, coherence, and responsibility. Because a company that sits at the center of global technology supply chains no longer competes only in markets. It participates in shaping the conditions under which modern life operates. Samsung's success has moved it from challenger to pillar, and pillars are judged by different standards than insurgents. The first test of this new phase is coherence. Samsung's greatest historical strength has been breadth. Semiconductors displays smartphones, appliances, networks, and emerging technologies all coexist under one corporate umbrella. This diversity provides resilience. When one sector slows, another accelerates. Yet at scale, diversity risks fragmentation. Innovation becomes incremental rather than directional. The challenge for Samsung is aligning its immense technical capability around a clear, long-term vision rather than a series of overlapping product cycles. Unlike companies built around a single narrative, Samsung must continually answer a harder question, not what it can build, but what it should prioritize. Semiconductors remain the strategic core of this question. As chips become the geopolitical currency of the 21st century, Samsung's role transcends commerce. Memory logic chips and advanced fabrication now sit at the heart of national security, AI development, and economic sovereignty. Samsung's decisions about where to invest, what to build, and whom to supply are no longer neutral. They are geopolitical acts. This places Samsung in a delicate position. It must balance speed and scale with diplomacy, compliance, and long-term trust. The survival instincts that once drove aggressive expansion must now coexist with restraint. Consumer electronics present a different tension. Samsung's devices are ubiquitous, but ubiquity can dull meaning. In smartphones especially, hardware differentiation has narrowed and software ecosystems dominate experience. Samsung's challenge is no longer proving it can build excellent devices, but ensuring those devices feel purposeful rather than interchangeable. Incremental improvements are necessary, but not sufficient. Brand identity must evolve from can do everything to does the right things well. This is a subtle but profound shift for a company whose culture has long been defined by execution speed rather than narrative clarity. Organizationally, Samsung faces the cost of its own success. Size brings inertia. Layers of management slow decision-making. Internal competition between divisions can dilute focus. The very systems that once enabled rapid imitation and scaling now risk slowing original innovation. Samsung has responded by decentralizing R&D investing heavily in next-generation technologies like AI bioengineering and advanced materials and recruiting global talent. But the deeper challenge is cultural. How do you preserve hunger in a company that already dominates so many fields? How do you encourage risk-taking when failure has systemic consequences? Ethics and social responsibility add another dimension. Samsung's influence over labor markets, environmental impact, and digital ecosystems is immense. As technology becomes inseparable from daily life, companies like Samsung are judged not only on what they make, but on how they make it and what they enable others to make. Sustainability, data privacy, and supply chain transparency are no longer optional narratives. They are operating requirements. Samsung's response, as always, has been systemic, integrate responsibility into process rather than posture. This mirrors its historical approach, but the stakes are higher now. Mistakes at this scale ripple globally. What makes Samsung's evolution unique is that it was never driven by a single ideology. Unlike companies built around a charismatic founder's vision, Samsung was built around adaptability. This has been both its strength and its ambiguity. Adaptability allows survival across eras. It also complicates identity. The next phase of Samsung's story will depend on whether adaptability can be paired with intention, whether speed can be guided by purpose rather than necessity. Looking back, Samsung's journey from trading company to tech giant reflects a broader pattern of modern industrial power. It shows how disciplined execution scale and patience can elevate a company from obscurity to centrality. It also shows that once centrality is achieved, the nature of success changes. Winning markets is replaced by sustaining ecosystems. Outrunning competitors is replaced by maintaining trust. In the end, Samsung's legacy will not be defined solely by products or profits, but by how it navigates this transition from national champion to global steward. The same qualities that once allowed Samsung to imitate, learn, and overtake must now evolve into qualities that allow it to guide, stabilize, and sometimes slow itself down. That is a far more difficult form of excellence, and this is the enduring lesson of Samsung's evolution survival in the early stages of growth, rewards, flexibility, and speed, but survival at the center of the world's technology. Infrastructure demands coherence, responsibility, and long-term judgment. Samsung's story is still unfolding, but it already stands as proof that becoming a giant is only half the journey. The harder half is learning how to carry that weight without losing the very adaptability that made the rise possible in the first place.